Welcome back to the Indian Debating League's motion breakdown series, where we're breaking down all the motions from Sofia World's 2026, at least the in rounds. My name is Krishaang. I am your host for lack of a better term, that I've been able to come up with yet. And I'm quite fascinated by the motion that we're breaking down today. And I'm fascinated by it for a few reasons. The first is that it involves a bunch of different moving parts that are connected in different ways. The second is that there are two very distinct ways that you could approach this motion. You could either do it in a spec illiterate way, where you just try to drill down, figure out what the exact burden is, and fulfill it to the best of your ability without having a lot of spec. Or at least you break the motion down into the mechanics, or like you investigate the mechanics of the motion, you identify what each moving part functionally is, even if you don't really understand what that does in the real world or what it's made up of or whatever. If you understand the real function of every moving part in this debate, for the purposes of this debate, what each moving part is doing to this debate, you will be able to make good case. And you, if you execute it well enough and have, you are logically rigorous enough and have enough persuasive examples, analogies, whatever, you could even score quite well and rank quite high and win a lot of rooms. The other way that to approach this motion and to debate this motion is a more speculative way, where you try to use background knowledge that you have about this motion to find specific pathways to victory that other people cannot predict. And if they can't predict those pathways to victory, then it's going to be harder for them to respond, harder for them to weigh their cases against yours, etc. So we're going to divide this session into three different parts. In the first part, we're going to mechanically break down this motion, and we will specifically figure out what each part of the motion is functionally, and how this motion is a composite of a variety of different motion types that channel the burden into a very specific direction. We're going to figure that out. Then we will move on to the spec illiterate approach, where I will give you ideas of clashes and stuff, where you and questions to ask yourself, so that you are able to come up with case on this motion, but also in any other kind of motion that has these same functional parts. The third part of the session is where we're going to cover the spec literate approach. First, we will get a little bit accustomed to the spec, and we will try to absorb a lot of it. Not a lot of it, but enough to debate this motion then. We will learn about things like strategic industries in the United States. We will figure out the current extent of involvement that the United States state has in the functioning of those industries. And we will also talk about, the precedents that has been set by various other countries with regards to the motion that we're going to debate and how they treat these golden shares, spoilers. And not lastly, but we will also be talking about the American population, both in terms of them being consumers and the products and services that they are at the receiving end of, but also them being workers and them fueling the industry that is being debated in this motion. Once we're done with that and we're done with the literacy part of the spec literate approach, we'll move on to the approach part, where we will figure out how to use the spec in the best ways possible. What I will try to do, not try to do, I've already planned this. What I will do is I will give you a bunch of questions that, now knowing a lot of the spec, you can ask yourself, and then I will give you two sample impacts for each side that I was able to come up with in 15 minutes. And those might not be the best impacts, but the goal is not to ensure that they are the best or the most debate-winning impacts, but to show you how you can use the spec that you have, and rather than randomly name dropping stuff that you know, how you can use it to fulfill certain burdens and skip certain steps that someone who lacks that spec might have to go through. So that's what the session is basically going to be like. If you're not interested in any particular part, you can skip ahead. I will try to ensure that I remember to put timestamps in the comments, so you can skip ahead to whatever you want to know about. And I hope we all walk away having learned something. So let's first read the info slide for round 6. Um, the info slide reads as follows. A golden share is a single, unique, state-held share that grants the government special veto and approval powers over strategic corporate decisions, such as foreign ownership, technology transfer, or asset relocation. Golden shares are typically created and transferred to the government through legislative or executive action. No explanation. This House believes that it is in the interests of the American people for the US government to acquire golden shares in strategically important firms, for example, NVIDIA, MP Materials, US Steel. Pause. Let's pause. And I know that for a significant proportion of the viewers of this video, uh, this motion and this info slide might just seem like a lot of words. It's just a bunch of jargon, and you are trying to identify what jargon you can maybe use and weaponize and all of that kind of stuff. And this is quite difficult, and it usually leads to poor debating, bad case making, and often it just leads to anxiety. It leads to being too worried in prep. It leads to being worried about the fact that, oh, I'm from a WGM SOC and I'm facing fintech bros, so they're going to beat me, or I'm facing someone who's been to the US 5 times and they're going to beat me, or someone who's chronically online, or someone who plays a lot of games. I don't know, right? All sorts of reasons for anxiety, and this motion type is not designed to evoke anxiety, but it often serves that purpose, unfortunately. So, what we're going to do is we're going to break down this motion into all of the different moving parts that exist in this motion. And in order to do that, first let's backtrack. Let's go up to the info slide, where we are talking about a golden share. A golden share is a thing that does a thing. Maybe you've seen Mission Impossible movies. I mean, they're quite popular. So in the Mission Impossible movies, what often happens is that Ethan Hunt, Tom Cruise, and his friends, they're trying to save the world from some big threat or whatever. And the entire plot of the movie is kind of centered around a thing, and that thing, the actual functioning of that thing really does not matter all that much, and the details of that thing really don't matter all that much. Even in the movie, they don't make up a significant part of the movie, but that thing serves as a motivator. That thing serves as the focal point of all of the action. It is the eye of the hurricane, whatever. So that thing is called a MacGuffin in TV terms, in storytelling terms, in storytelling mechanics terms. Um, a MacGuffin is basically anything that's just a plot device. So, for example, in the Impossible movies, a MacGuffin is usually, say, like nuclear bombs or nuclear codes, or like I don't know, some big virus, or like a big box with a button, whatever. Like something that is motivating, that everyone is trying to steal, everyone wants to defend, everyone wants to protect, everyone wants to hide, whatever. In different movies there are different MacGuffins, in different books there are different MacGuffins. Another example that comes to mind is, for example, the Ocean's trilogy or any heist movies. In a heist movie, the bank itself really does not matter. The quantity of money inside the bank really does not matter. People are often stealing things like, I don't know, like fancy paintings. Like there's movies about like stealing the Mona Lisa, or stealing a Fabergé egg, or whatever. But it does not matter. These things are fundamentally interchangeable. They just serve a function in the plot. In this motion, a golden share is a MacGuffin. And often in these sorts of economics finance motions, but also for my viewers out there who are maybe more of the technical bent, maybe who feel that they're stronger in finance motions and economics than I are, but here comes the feminism motion, or here comes the American pop culture motion that's going to kick my ass. Like even for those people, all motions and often almost info slides also have these mechanics, which are easily identifiable, and these patterns end up repeating. And debating often ends up being about identifying these patterns and using them to your advantage. So here a golden share is a MacGuffin. Uh, it does something in the debate. Okay. It does something actually really technical. It gives the government special veto and approval powers, blah, 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 blah. But what matters here is that this MacGuffin, our golden share, grants the government something. From this, what we're able to identify is that the MacGuffin in this debate is something that is making the government strong. The state had a certain amount of power, and now the state has a higher amount of power because of this MacGuffin that this debate is going to be centered on. What is that power? In a Mission Impossible movie, that power might be to destroy the rogue AGI that's taking over the world with that's the power of the virus or whatever. Um, but in this case, the power is a veto and approval power. Uh, a veto is basically when you and I promise I'm not trying to mansplain, but I'm trying to optimize for accessibility and explaining as much jargon as I can. But for those that don't know, a veto is basically when you are able to just say no. When someone else plans something out, they want to take an action, but irrespective of anything, if at the end you say no, that's the final word on the matter, and that's not open for discussion. And approval powers. Approval means yay, yes, okay. So this is basically giving the government the ability to say yes or no. That's what our MacGuffin in this debate is doing. It is making the government stronger. It is making the state stronger by giving it a certain amount of agency and ability to be able to say yes or no. The other stuff for now does not really matter for this specific approach. Ideally, I would say that you should analyze the context slide as a whole. So how golden shares are created and transferred is also important because they are saying that it is done through legislative action, which is like through parliament, or through executive action, which is through like the people who are the heads of the country. So it's either the big law-making body of the country with a lot of members that is giving the state this power, or it is the president, prime minister, whatever premier of a country that's giving the state this power. But honestly, this really does not matter for the time being, I promise. Now let's go to our wall of words, this brilliant motion. Uh, there's a few things to note here. First, this motion starts with this house believes that statement. In the previous session that we had, where we were talking about truth value motions, we talked about how THBT motions are always, always, always truth value motions, where the burden of a this house believes that motion is to prove that the statement that comes after the this house believes that motion is true. In that session, we said this statement is X, whatever comes after this house believes that. Now, if we say go back to this, okay, if we go back to our info slide where we were talking about MacGuffins, where we were talking about things that are happening and stuff, and we were finding different analogies. I just want to note that those analogies can come from any kind of system that has structure. What do I mean? I mean that in previous sessions, I've used very mathematical analogies to be able to explain motions and their burdens to you, X and Y and all of that stuff, which is what I called back to here as well. And here I'm telling you about Mission Impossible and stuff. But here you could also just say it's X. You are at the end of the day, you're trying to identify variables that repeat across different motions, repeat across different themes and types, but functionally act in the same way. So you could call it X, or we can give it a name from something that you might be familiar with. For me, I love film, TV, anything to do with storytelling, books. Wow, I love books. What a crazy brag. But I find the mechanics of storytelling and all the moving parts inside stories and the functions that everything plays inside a story to be interesting. So I think that this is a good analogy. You can use whatever analogies you want. In the past, while coaching students, I've used analogies like debating is a house building and selling contest. Debating is about who has the fastest car, and it's like Formula One, where it's not just the driver, it's a car. Whatever kind of analogy you're able to use, as long as it puts you in a mindset where you have more pattern based thinking and you're able to recognize the same thing over and over again in different contexts. That's good. Anyway, unnecessary detours aside, it's a THBT motion. Every single thing that comes after the THBT we need to prove is true. So, okay, what do we need to prove is true? It is in the interests of the American people for the US government to blah, 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 blah. Let's first break down all of these different things. It is in the interests. What this basically means is it is good for. It is good for whom? It is good for American people, for the US government to acquire these shares. Now, if I were to tell you to identify the actor or actors in this motion, what a lot of people would say is that the actor is the US government. What a lot of people would say is that the actor is the American people. Some people would say both. And there's something I'll talk about in just a second. And then we come to the action, which is to acquire our little MacGuffin, our golden shares in strategically important firms. So the focal point of this debate is the acquisition of golden shares. This is what this debate is actually about. There are a bunch of words above this. There are a bunch of words below this, but you should be able to identify what this debate is about, which is the acquisition of golden shares. Now, let's go to the burdens, where I kind of want to dissect the different burdens of this motion. Because this is an actor's motion. If this is in a judge test, and if someone asks you, hey, is this an actor's motion? You'd probably say yes. And most CAs would consider that to be correct. And we do have to evaluate the debate based on the actor's incentives, as we have to do in any actor's motion, as we did in the MBS motion, where we talk about the wants, needs, priorities, and moral considerations of the actor. But here, what's important, and in fact, thinking about the MBS motion, this is actually quite similar to the MBS motion in the motion type. But here in this motion, there are two actors. The most common answer that a lot of you will give is that there are two different actors. But one of the actors isn't really taking an action. If you think about it, even though we're talking about if this is something that's in the interests of the American people are actually not really doing anything in this motion. They are just going to be the people who are going to be at the receiving end of all of the impacts that proposition is going to cause. Okay, so if this is true, I think it is, and this is the pattern that maybe you should make, so that you don't get confused, is that you should maybe consider this to be a stakeholder motion instead of an actor's motion. What that means is it's like a standard analysis motion, but the most important stakeholder is given away in the motion itself, while there is an actor. Because again, what is this motion about? To acquire MacGuffins, to acquire golden shares. Who is acquiring the golden shares? The actor in this debate is the US government. I'm going to go on another bit of a tangent now. Actually, you know what? I will postpone my tangent. Okay. So we don't necessarily care about the well-being of the actor who is taking the action. And this is also a big mistake that people often make. So the US government that we are talking about here, that is actually acquiring these golden shares, we don't care if this leads to good or bad to the US government. We only care about the interests of the US government as an extension of the interests of the American people. If the American people are not affected by any harm or benefit to the US government, that harm or benefit is not going to be a part of this debate. So TLDR, we must prove that this action will be beneficial to the American people, even if the American people themselves have very limited agency, not very, but at least limited agency over this action, over proposition. So this is the first part of the motion. The second part of the motion is that, and this is the reason that you would be correct to call it an actor's motion, is because it is a THB, it's kind of, it's a THBT. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a THBT X should do Y, because there you have a certain amount of fiat. But it's something that's in that vein. And here you don't even have that fiat because it's more analysis-y. So I would say that the burden in this motion is to provide a model or a policy, even though you don't have fiat, because it is very important to explain how this acquisition is of these MacGuffins, of these golden shares, is actually going to happen. Because in the process of that explanation, and often in the process of that acquisition, you will inevitably come up with a bunch of harms and benefits and stuff. But also, while you are focusing on that acquisition, you should also know that the impacts that happen in the process of the action, the impacts that happen in the process of this to acquire golden shares, are usually also the most certain impacts in the debate. These are the most certain impacts, which are the easiest to weigh, and where you can just say that, okay, everything else that happens as a consequence of this action happening in the future is somewhat speculative, but stuff that is happening as process benefit or process harm of this action happening is way more certain. So it is very, very useful in this debate, irrespective of whether you're prop or not, to be able to figure out how this is actually going to happen. So you do ideally need to give a model or a policy, but you don't have fiat. What is fiat? Fiat is basically, for people who are not in the know, fiat is the amount of resources that you have, specifically mostly in policy motions and THW motions. It is the amount of resources that you have to be able to carry out your policy in a fair way, in a fair execution of that policy. So, for example, if the motion is this house would ban alcohol, you probably have the money to be able to do this, to be able to execute the on-ground actions that would be required in this ban, closing shops and all that stuff, whatever. You assume that you have manpower. You assume that when you create rules like, I don't know, that there's going to be, I don't know, 5 years jail for drinking alcohol. You have the manpower, that is, you have enough police to be able to enforce this, and so on and so forth. You also have time that is required for this proposition to go through. You also have political will, and in different motions, there are a lot of different things that you have the fiat for. And the amount of fiat that you actually have, and here is the tangent that I wanted to go on earlier, is completely contingent on who the actor is. Which is why, even though you are a little bit handicapped by this motion, not giving you fiat to be able to directly model, what this motion is still doing for you is it's telling you who the actor is, which is the US government. And this is important in order to determine a reasonable amount of fiat that you can exercise. So, how to explain this? Okay, so if you don't know who the actor is, then you don't know the amount of resources this actor has access to. So in a lot of policy motions that are not actors motions, which are just TSW blah blah blah, you don't know who the actor is. You don't know the amount of resources this actor has access to, and therefore you're at risk. You are at two types of risk. The first type of risk that you are at is to overestimate the amount of fiat that you have. And when you end up doing this, the teams that are across the aisle are going to call you out for being uncharitable, for having really utopian models and really utopian worldviews and all of that kind of stuff. The second risk that you're at is underutilizing fiat, which is bad because fiat basically allows you to skip a certain amount of mechanistic legwork to be able to prove certain impacts and to be able to prove certain premises. So knowing who the actor is very good because you know exactly the amount of resources that they have access to. In this specific case, because we know the US government, we know how much resources the US government actually has access to. The only thing that we need to do is that we need to prove the likelihood. So whenever we explain how this policy is going to be executed, we also need to explain why this is the most likely way in which this policy is going to be executed. Gov must prove that this policy is executed in good ways. Op must likely to be executed in good ways. Op must prove that it's likely to be executed in bad ways. I'm saying must prove. These are not musts, but these are very useful, helpful things. So these are the basic burdens of this motion. You should be giving a policy. You should be proving the likelihood of that policy, not really taking fiat, but you know some stuff about the US government, so you're able to understand how much you can actually dedicate to this policy. But also, you need to understand that we're trying to benefit the American people and not the American state. And we, going forward, need to have this always at the back of our heads, that the interests of the American people, while there may be some overlap of the interests of the American people and the interests of the American state, this small section of overlap is at the end of the day just a small section of overlap. There are many interests of the American people that the American state does not share. So with that out of the way, we are now done with the first section of this session. Now we're going to jump ahead in this presentation a little bit. Because initially I planned to do the spec bit first, but I realized that there is no reason to make people sit through finance and economics if they don't want to. So yeah, we're going to jump straight to part 2 of this session, which is the spec illiterate approach. So we know that the end goal of this debate and the end metric of this debate is where are the people of America better off, in the sense that where are their interests better fulfilled. This debate is a tug of war between both sides to try to fulfill those interests. How do you win the round if you don't have spec? When we broke down this motion, we figured out that our MacGuffin basically gives the state more control over something it already did not have control over, or at least as much control over. Here, we should basically be coming up with a few very obvious impacts. I mean, impacts on both sides, basically, like metrics. Okay, like spheres of influence. For example, in the sphere of international relations and soft power, whenever you're talking about a country that is trying to execute a policy, specifically a policy that has to do with that obviously affects other countries, because here we're talking about strategically important industries and the American state intervening in them. Therefore, the interaction that these industries will be able to have with other countries is going to be a little lower, or if not lower, then at least up to debate. Like not lower, but in the sense it's going to be complicated by this motion. This motion might benefit it, it might harm it. When we know this and we're able to come to this conclusion from our analysis of the motion itself, even if we don't know a lot of spec, we have identified who the actor is, who we care about, what is actually happening. Now, the first metric that we should probably think about is international relations and soft power. Because if this is a policy, and think back to the signaling mechanism that we had discussed in the past few sessions, even if you don't necessarily exactly know what this policy is going to do on the ground, you can still try to figure out what the signaling of this policy is going to be to foreign countries and companies. This is a motion. Proposition is something that gives the state more control and more power over something it did not have as much control or as much power over. Are other countries going to be happy with this? What image of the United States is this going to portray to foreign investors? What image of the United States is this going to portray to foreign countries and governments that are planning to make trade deals with the US and stuff? So, how are they likely to perceive the fact that the American state has had to take more control in this? You need to question whether foreign investors are going to be more or less comfortable investing in the United States now. And you also, even if again you don't know a lot of economics, you don't know a lot of, I don't know, like golden share or whatever, but what does the US want? The US has stuff that the US wants to sell, and the US is always looking for many different countries that they can have access to for their companies, goods, and services. How many markets is the United States going to have access to now? Is this number more or less than status quo? Is the US going to be able to access more markets and be able to trade with more countries, or more demographic sections of the same countries? Or is the US basically going to be kicked out or weakened in various markets that it already has access over? These are a bunch of different mini debates that you can have under this motion, even if you don't have spec. And you can go down these lines, generate analysis using whatever you know, and you will be able to probably make a competent case. The problem with spec illiterate cases is that having one single case line usually does not work, because the longer that case line goes, the more and more assumptions you imbibe into that case line. The longer your chain of logic is, the higher the number of links in that chain that are not like something that you know for certain to be true. The longer and longer you make the chain, the more bad links there are, the more chinks there are in this armor. And when these like, yeah, you know how you tell a lie and then you're interrogated for that lie, and then you basically have to tell another lie to cover it up, and another lie, and another lie, and so on and so forth. And it gets more and more difficult. It's the same thing with going too deep into one specific path. If you are taking a spec illiterate approach, it will make your case more and more unviable. You will eventually make an assumption that will be caught by the other team, and you will not rank well in the round. The second metric, or the second kind of mini debate that you can have that can guide your case making, is internal signaling. Because if we have already talked about how this move is going to affect how foreign companies perceive of the US, now we can also think about how people will react inside the US. How will companies and investors react to losing some control to the state? And here we divide these stakeholders a little bit. So, there are certain companies and investors that are directly affected by this motion. If we just go up a lot, yeah, I mean, we went up too far. But there are certain companies, and for example, these three companies, NVIDIA, MP Materials, and US Steel, and basically all companies that exist in strategically important firms that are directly going to be affected by proposition. But also there are a bunch of companies that are not directly affected by proposition, but there is some signaling that goes to them. So these specific companies where there is more control, how are they going to react to the fact that they are losing a certain amount of control to the state? Are they going to be happy that there was too much of a burden on them that they were not able to handle on their own, and now the state is helping them out? Are they going to be pissed because the state is, I don't know, like slowing them down, or the state is poking its nose in too much, and they just want to be independent? And wasn't America supposed to be the land of the free anyway? So how will these people react? But also, how will other companies and investors who are not directly affected by this motion react to the idea that the American government is doing something to get more control over something inside its country that it did not have strong enough control over? Because this is something of a concession symbolically that the American government makes, that we did not have enough control over these strategic industries, over the decisions that they were making. So what does this say about the state? And the fact that they are willing to, whenever they feel so, they are willing to take actions that enable them to get more control. You will have a lot of industries and a lot of different sectors of the economy thinking, hey, what if we're next? What if we will have to give up some control to the state? Will these companies end up staying or running away? And when the state actually asks for control and imposes regulations, imposes a veto power, will these companies cooperate with the state, or will there be friction? These are all questions that you should be asking, because the answers to these questions are impacts on either side of the ground, and all of these are independently, like, I wouldn't say debate winning, but at least like strong impacts that you can land. Like, if you're just able to prove that, for example, companies are not going to cooperate with the state when it exercises this veto power, you will be able to use this impact premise thingy, and you will be able to derive a bunch more different impacts from this, as to how things slow down, as to how, I don't know, the state has to double down, which leads to more friction, whatever. You'll be able to generate a bunch of impacts if you prove this premise. Uh, let's talk about the third metric thing that you should be thinking about if you don't have a lot of spec, which is the state is taking more control over something it didn't have control over, in the sense that it is taking control over private entities and private corporations. So the age-old debate of state versus corporate comes in. There are two different actors here: the state, which is, like, let's just call it public, and then the private. So which of these actors, the public sector or the private sector, have incentives that align more with the public? And of course, there's stock argumentation here on both sides. If you're supporting the private sector, you usually say that the competition in trying to get as much profit as you possibly can leads to good outcomes, because you end up caring about your consumers, because you need them to buy your stuff. And then you can have counter arguments against this. People who want to defend the state can very easily say that the state is obligated to the people because there's a social contract, yada yada yada. So there are incentives, but you need to analyze this, even if you're spec illiterate, with more nuance. You can't just leave it at that simplistic analysis. You need to be able to figure out that in status quo in 2025, which of these actors have displayed, maybe, but even if they haven't displayed, they're likely to have incentives that align more with the public. But the second question that you should be answering, in order to make case this way, is which of these actors are more fluid and therefore willing and able to change in order to comply with public demand, in the sense that if you have public, you have private. And when I say public demand, I mean the people of the country, the interests of the American people, those people. When they say this is bad, something that's happening, when they say this is bad, who changes quicker? Do companies course correct quicker, or does the state course correct quicker? And now that these two forces are going to be interacting, how fast or slow is this course correction going to be? What is going to be the minimum threshold of dissent that needs to exist for this unified entity now, not really unified, but like kinda, to be able to course correct? And lastly, you should also ask yourself, does the public know what it needs? Because if you are trying to answer the previous question about which actor is more fluid and more able to comply and willing to comply with public demand, you should know that whatever the public demands does not automatically mean that the thing is in the benefit of the public. That the public's demands are not always aligned with the interests of the public. The people are irrational. Everyone knows this to a certain extent. So you can also prove that people are rational. You can also prove that people are irrational. In debate land, you can do a lot of things, and you should be able to strategically prove for your side that people are either rational or irrational, and therefore then use those rational or irrational people to be levers and use those levers to be able to influence the state and this private entity and the conglomeration, and use that to be able to prove that there's more benefits to your side and stuff. So even if you don't have a lot of spec, you will be able to have, I think, significantly nuanced argumentation if you ask yourself many different questions under each burden and try to go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Question your assumptions. Think about non-binary ways in which things can play out. Think about the gray areas, and you will be able to make case. So that brings us to the end of the second part of this session, where we already covered the spec illiterate approach. Now what we're going to do is we're going to study some spec. Study is the wrong word, but we're going to go over some spec. Here is some spec that I was able to compile that is useful to be able to debate this motion. The first important thing is to understand strategic importance. You need to know what actually counts as strategically important in the US economy. So, in general, when we say strategic industries or industries of strategic importance, I've written US policy language, but also just in most countries policy language. Strategic usually refers to bottlenecks where a disruption spreads across many sectors and takes years to unwind. Basically, a strategic industry is a point of failure. It is like remember the chain I was talking about. Remember the line chain, the assumption chain, where the longer it gets, the more weak points that it has. A strategic industry is like one of those weak points. It doesn't have to be weak, but the idea is that if there is a bottleneck there, I mean, it is the bottleneck, but if there is a shock there, if there is a disruption there, that disruption ends up spreading to a lot of different sectors and ends up affecting a large number of people's lives. And it takes many years to be able to actually reverse the kinds of changes. So what do we mean when we talk about strategic industries? First, let's analyze what a bottleneck can be in more generalist terms. So whenever you, and this doesn't really have to do with, like, say, the United States, but there are two types of basically bottlenecks that can exist. The first type of bottleneck is physical capacity. So that refers to the assets that you actually have, your mines, your mills, your factories. And the second is your system capacity. Maybe this is not just to do with digital systems, but to do with operational systems. So what sorts of software tool chains you're using, what are the most common tools that you're using, but also the standards that you're holding yourself to, the health and safety standards that you're holding yourself to, the compliance, not compliance, like the certain, I don't know, the quality standards that you're trying to hold yourself to at every part of production, the specialization of your talent pools. If a talent pool dries up too much, and if there's not enough talent that goes into an industry to be able to run it competently, that also ends up creating these kinds of disruptions. So these are maybe the two main types of bottlenecks. I would also argue that another bottleneck is just politics. I think politics is a big bottleneck, and we will also at least dip our feet into how politics can engage with this stuff, but we will not do it from a party versus party perspective. We will talk about the American people and break certain misconceptions that people have about American people. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So let's go back. What these dependencies that we're talking about may not always, and these bottlenecks that we're talking about may not always be like very visible. For example, this can be the components of an electrical grid. These can be specific raw materials that are necessary catalysts for certain chemical reactions to happen in certain industries, or construction inputs, or vehicle supply chains. And something that's becoming more and more relevant now, especially for this motion, because NVIDIA has mentioned, which is cloud computing capacity. The example firms, these three example firms, and we'll go deeper into them in a second, all three of these example firms align to different bottleneck types. So when you're talking about NVIDIA, the bottleneck that largely NVIDIA has is compute platform, the ability to process information and store information in large sums at high speeds, large quantities at high speeds. Then MP materials is related to magnet supply chains, something really important in the US, which we will come to. And US steel is obviously related to heavy industrial steel. So the reason that this motion even exists is because these industries are important. They're strategic for the United States and they really need to pay special attention to these industries, because any failure in these industries will spread very fast, will spread very hard. It will take a lot of years to be able to reverse it. Okay. let's now head to the second thing, and let's cover the key strategic sectors that have been given as examples in the motion. Um, the first that I want to do is NVIDIA. Uh, I also think it's really important for okay, whenever you're making case and there are certain examples that are given in the motion, you should never limit yourself to those examples, obviously, but you should probably spend some time thinking about those examples and why those examples are even a part of this debate. And I'll give you a very simple reason for this. A very simple reason for this is that the examples that CAP usually uses are often the inspiration for the motion. So in a lot of motions, the examples of the policy or the examples of the companies or examples of whatever objects are being covered in the debate, these examples are usually and recent activities around those examples or something controversial about those examples, something debatable about those examples is often what inspires the debate. And if you dig deeper into those examples, you'll probably be able to make better case. So first, we're going to talk about NVIDIA, semiconductors, full annoyers. How does this whole chip manufacturing thing even work? Uh, Most US chip companies largely focus on designing those chips, okay? But manufacturing is something that is performed by specialized foundries is the correct word though. But I'm trying to find a different word for it. Basically, specialized units, and there are so many components to the manufacturing of a chip that any one of those components going, and all of those components are so important and so unique in the way that they exist that any of those components going wrong could create a disruption and make that a bottleneck kind of point. And this is exceptionally true for AI chips. Why is this true? So first I want to explain is what the regular chip supply chain even has. So the first thing it has is obviously wafer fabrication. So okay, wait, what is a wafer? A, a semiconductor of a specific type that has been chemically amended to be suitable for the purposes of making a chip. Uh, that's what and cut and all that stuff. That's what we call a wafer. Usually, we use a big slab, like a big semiconductor slab, and we inscribe a bunch of different chips onto that slab, and then we cut out all of these chips. The process of inscribing circuits onto those wafers is what we call fabrication. So you need to have a wafer fabrication ability. Then you need to have chemicals and gases and lithography tools. This is just to make the wafer, than to ensure that it's accurate, because the accuracy in this kind of production is incredibly important. Then you need to be able to package it well. Packaging refers to a couple of things. First, bringing a lot of different parts of a single chip together. That's also assembly, to be honest. But also, what packaging here is talking about is logistical packaging, because we said that the supply chain for these chips is quite global, and there are many dependencies, and a lot of the materials that are used are so sensitive that they require very special and specific conditions for transfer. Then it's the assembly of the chip itself, but also assembly of the chip and integrating it with certain products, with certain appliances is the wrong word, but with certain components, and then you have to test it, of course. And all of these different steps have their own bottlenecks and their ability and have an ability to have a disruption, and that disruption could affect everything. If your wafer fabrication process is not working correctly, none of this matters because you're making inaccurate chips in bulk. If you're doing everything correctly, but the packaging and transport of certain components between places is not happening accurately, then you're wasting money, so on and so forth. Advanced AI chips are even more complicated because advanced AI chips rely on multi-component packaging and high bandwidth memory integration, which links performance and output to packaging capacity and specialized weight. Hold on. What does all of this mean? I'm trying to think of a way to explain. So, okay, when I say multi-component packaging here, the way that I want you guys to maybe think of an AI chip is an AI chip, an advanced AI chip that like it's not an AI chip, but like a chip that's used for AI. An advanced AI chip is a chip that is like a mega chip. It is a chip which has a bunch of different smaller chips that are either stacked on top of each other, or they are usually just stacked on top of each other and parallel to each other. But Basically, there's a configuration of many mini chips. A lot of these mini chips have different purposes that they serve inside the overall chip. And high bandwidth memory integration basically means that when you have all of these chips, mini chips that are stacked on top of each other, and this mega chip, AI chip, has a bunch of these different components, uh, how fast can information or even an electric signal travel between these components? We need to make sure, for the purposes of AI chips, that this transfer of data, or this transfer of information, this transfer of energy is something that is incredibly fast, even if the input is large in size. So this is basically what I'm sure my material science professor would not be very happy with me right now with this explanation, but I think that it is sufficient to explain that basically AI chips are even harder to make than regular chips. They are more complicated to make, and they have very specific conditions. This high bandwidth memory thing, which I was just explaining, quick data transfer inside the chip, all of this matters a lot. And the performance of these chips, which is the benchmark that is set, and the output that they're able to have, is something that's incredibly important. Also, when we're talking about access in the chip sector, we're talking about access to multiple layers at once, not layers of the chip, even though I just talked about stack chips, but layers of the supply chain. So you have to manufacture, you have to have good packaging capability, you need to have reliable logistics for high value components. And also, these chips are often bought by, of course, the private sector and Silicon Valley and a bunch of startups and whatever, and also by big tech giants. But they are also often bought by the United States government, by the United States Department of Defense, and by the governments of many countries. So, ensuring that data is secure, ensuring that the specific requirements that a client or a customer has of a company, all of these different things end up becoming potential bottlenecks. Okay, because where when I say sensitive volumes, if, for example, some country suddenly orders a large volume of chips and forces the production of a large volume of chips, that itself is a signal, that itself is going to affect the market, that itself is going to affect demand from other companies, it's going to affect the supply chain as well. And this all, what's most important in all of this is customer relationships, because customer relationships themselves are a bottleneck. Because imagine you put all of this effort into making this big fancy chip, and then your customer is not happy with you for whatever reason. They don't trust you, or they found a better competitor or whatever, and they no longer want to work with you. The TLDR of this entire explanation that I've just done is that semiconductors are quite annoying. Semiconductors are annoying, and they're very strategic for the United States, not just because of AI and the potential uses of AI, and also not just because of the deep integration that these chips have in our daily lives, in all sorts of appliances and stuff that we use, and basically the functioning of the economy. It's not just about the chips themselves, it's about the supply chain of the chips. It's about how any one thing going wrong could probably lead to other things going wrong, but also it could make stuff that has gone right redundant, which is why all of this is a strategic industry. If this industry gets bottlenecked, I mean, it is a bottleneck. If there is a shock here, that shock will spread. Next, magnets. We talked about MP. Now we're going to talk about what they do. They deal not just with magnets, but with rare earth minerals overall, rare earth, whatever they're able to. Uh, rare earth minerals, I mean, I don't need to explain. This is basically what it says on the tin. But the problem and the bottleneck with rare earth minerals, and specifically with minerals that you could potentially use for electromagnets, is not in the initial process where you are identifying a site or setting up equipment and stuff, because magnets are something that scientists have been studying for hundreds, if not thousands of years at this point. So we know to a certain extent what we need to do. Mining is as old a human activity as anything else that you could think of. So this is not as much of an issue. What's an issue is the downstream process. For example, when you mine an ore, or when you mine, and I won't even use the word ore. When you mine some rock from the ground, and that rock has a bunch of different minerals inside it, in a heterogeneous composition, how are you going to be able to get the stuff that you want out of it without getting the pollutants out of it? Then you need to be able to ensure that you have metal production and alloy production, and then you need to be able to manufacture these magnets at scale. Why are you trying to manufacture these magnets at scale? Because we're not talking about fridge magnets here. We're talking about huge electromagnets that are used in industry. So I think most factories, if they are, I'm sure you've heard that automation is increasing, jobs are going and all that stuff. So in the machines that are used for industrial automation, uh, there are often electromagnets that are attached to those machines. And the reason for this is that the whole purpose of electromagnets, it has a bunch, they have a bunch of purposes. They're able to control and alter the flow of current. They're able to help us generate electricity, which is also a big reason that they're a strategic industry. But in the case of industrial automation, um, electromagnets are important because they allow us to exert a very large amount of magnetic force, or basically just a very large amount of force in a very controlled and predictable manner. And therefore, these magnets become very crucial and irreplaceable. And the more and more the country shifts towards industrial automation, the United States shifts towards industrial automation, the more the importance of magnets. But also in things like wind generation, and also in things like defense systems. Like I said, the DoD buys a lot of this stuff. How does this market work related to rare earth minerals and magnets? This market has a record of sharp price swings. So this means that this is not really a predictable market. In fact, this is a market that has sudden sudden highs and sudden lows. And the reason for this is like not just that the construction timelines are long, but that the length of the construction timeline creates opportunity for disruption. Like when you place an order for something and you have to wait for a long time before you actually get what you ordered, that is all the more time for the chef to either make something really good, but also maybe to make your order and let it go stale, or maybe something else went wrong in the process or whatever. This is not my best analogy, I won't lie, but the idea is that the length of the construction timeline itself creates compounds the number of bottlenecks that can exist, and creates chances of disruption. And whenever this kind of disruption actually happens, it again, if we go back to what we were talking about when in terms of NVIDIA, whenever this kind of disruption actually happens, what this leads to is a loss of investor confidence, because people think that we poured in so much money and all it took is this to this tiny little thing, this tiny little failure in the system for our money to basically get wasted, which means that it becomes even more difficult to get more and more private financing for midstream facilities. This is important because the only way that you can actually reduce the amount of disruptions that exist, or like the disruptions that are going to occur over any average year in America in the earth industry, rare earth minerals industry, is to have innovation and to have more scale in these midstream facilities, so that you're able to maybe diversify risk, split the load, and innovation is needed so that the chances of the chances of a disruption can actually reduce, the risk at every step can actually reduce. So this is the issue in the industry, which makes it a strategic industry, but B, also really vulnerable and prone. The United States government has not been ignoring this industry. What it usually does is that it has long-term purchase commitments. So if the issue that it has seen already in this kind of industry is that there are sudden spikes and stuff of prices, and there is not enough continued money put in for the companies involved to be able to make investments in their internal infrastructure, they commit to long-term contracts. They commit to having price support and ensuring that the prices don't suddenly drop, and the consumers of these companies don't suddenly start underpaying them and stuff. There's also targeted financing, but this is a completely different tangent that I don't want to go on. I've gone on too many tangents. The reason that there's that MP materials actually exists in this motion is because it's a combination of both. First, the mining of these magnets is usually in the US, and that's what MP materials engages in. But also, it is the ability to improve the supply chain of the production and transportation and implementation of these magnets, and ensure that the capacity of having these magnets at the end stage is actually fulfilled to sustainably without the volatility that's already there, but B, is fulfilled to an extent that it can lead to enough good impacts in industry. For example, if there's enough reliable magnet production that's happening every single year. This means that there could potentially be more automation, which means that factories could work faster and all of that kind of stuff, right? So the idea is that both of these things are really important, which is why this is a strategic industry and the company was mentioned. Last, US Steel. Come on, Superman, stupid line. Okay, so why is steel important? Steel is important because steel is used to build stuff. And this is maybe not, I thought a lot about whether I should include this in this session or not, because I think that even if you don't have a lot of economic spec or like aren't keeping up with news and stuff, you probably are still able to make the connection that you use steel to build stuff. But what's more important here, apart from just the uses of steel, is the issues in the steel industry that I'm trying to identify. The first issue is that large steel assets, so bulk quantities of steel, or like not just quantities of steel, but assets of steel that are built in specific ways, specific shapes to execute specific functions, are slow to replace. They're slow to relocate. For example, steel foundries are very slow to relocate. There's a lot of work that goes into taking these assets, transporting them safely to a different place, and then maybe building a new factory. The capital expenditure cycle is also not very predictable, but also the issue is that, and this is also again similar to the magnets thing, which is that the workforce requirements in order to be able to execute a contract of having, I don't want to say 50 tons of steel because that's not what they actually do. They provide different varieties of steel at different like specifications according to certain needs. And what they also do is, like I said, they mold and shape the steel in various ways so that it can already serve certain functions. So in order to be able to execute all of this, there are a lot of years that go into the process. And what have we learned? The more time that goes into the process, the more the chance of something going wrong. And here what I want to highlight is, and I will come to this a little bit more later when we talk about the existing US regulations, is ownership and governance disputes, to what extent they happen right now. Because the disputes that usually happen inside not just MP Steel but companies like this is, how do you allocate capital long term? Because should you put all of your capital into ensuring that you have enough inventory to fulfill your orders, or should you invest your capital into building the not infrastructure, but building the required apparatus? Or I'm not able to think of the right word, but I hope you know what I mean. But I think infrastructure is the correct word. Like plant. I've written plant. So building the right sorts of plants and stuff inside those plants and modernizing those plants to be able to improve your capacity in the future. And as you keep trying to find a balance between these priorities as the steel company, you need to make sure your current assets, the plants that you already have, when do you choose to decommission these plants? Which plants do you choose to modernize or not modernize? Which plants do you choose to relocate? What are you actually doing? What plants are going to be the center point? And the reason that all of this is important, and you can't like really make like split second decisions or take decisions based on your whims and fancies, is because steel, especially compared to semiconductors and magnets. I mean, it's somewhat similar to magnets, but this is something that's very different to the semiconductor industry. Is that steel decisions that are taken by steel companies are anchored in politics. They are anchored in what unions want. They are anchored in local tax bases. So, because the idea is when you set up a steel plant, it is expected to operate for a long period of time. And this steel plant usually grows some kind of like plant city around it, where the employees usually live, they work in the plant, there are ancillary industries, there's shops, there's schools, there's hospitals, all that kind of stuff. This plant usually ends up kind of becoming the backbone of a particular region. So decisions regarding this plant end up becoming really, really sensitive, especially when you think about how the risks of automation and stuff that we were discussing that are happening because of the magnet stuff are happening. So people are becoming even more protective of their jobs. They're becoming even more sensitive to the smallest of changes that management are making. I'm talking about unions. Unions are becoming more sensitive, and even local tax bases. So even if you don't necessarily work for the steel plant, but you pay taxes in this specific region, you may have incentives to maybe want this to continue. You may have incentives to maybe get rid of this and get something else better, whatever. So any decision around this ends up becoming affected by politics, which is why earlier when I was talking about the types of bottlenecks that can exist. The third type of bottleneck that I identified was political will and political uncertainty, rather, because this is something that's really important and can create massive disruptions. Strikes have created massive disruptions in the past. Also, one more thing to note here when it comes to the steel industry, and this is now not true for the magnet industry as much, but this is kind of true for the semiconductor industry. But because the US is quite established in steel, it's more important, which is that the operating environment of the steel industry inside the United States is affected a lot by the policy decisions that the United States government makes to trade with foreign countries. So, one way that the steel industry operates inside the United States is companies competing among themselves. The same old capitalism spiel. But the difference is that along with just free market competition being the driver of governance decisions that management makes in these companies, what also matters a lot is the decisions that the state makes. Specifically in steel, because usually the policy, the bilateral or multilateral agreements that the United States often enters in, they use steel as not a bargaining chip, but as something that they're often throwing into the deal with various different countries. So this could be which countries are we going to procure certain raw materials from, which countries are we going to supply certain things to. These things end up affecting the internal environment of steel production as well, apart from just main market competition, and also ends up creating a bottleneck because the signaling of how the US is executing trade policies outside the country affects the steel industry inside the country, and then bottleneck can happen, which will affect outside the country, and so on and so on. It's a cycle. So, what have we learned from these three key strategic sectors? We have basically figured out why these sectors are so strategic. We have figured out why there is such a dependency on these sectors in the United States, especially on these companies. But we have also figured out why this motion even exists, why there could even be a need for intervention because of the sensitivity of these sectors, because of the plurality of bottlenecks that exist, and the high risk of disruption at any level that can happen, which could end up like snowballing into all sorts of negative things. Now let's come to the third thing, which is how does the United States deal with this kind of stuff in status quo? So, when I say deals with this kind of stuff, I mean what is the US policy towards these strategic firms? Because again, in this debate, if you're going to try to create a delta, you need to know how much of a change is actually happening. The first thing you probably need to know about is the CFIUS. What is the CFIUS? The CFIUS is a government committee. I think it was something like Commission on Committee or Foreign Investment into the United States, something of that sort. So, what it basically does is it reviews certain foreign investment deals just on the basis of the risk that these deals can potentially pose to national security. So things like buyouts that foreign governments are trying to do of strategic industries, things like sensitive real estate, that is like, say, near air bases or naval bases and stuff, access to sensitive tech, access to sensitive data. This is the government agency that has the ambit over this. What are they actually able to do? They have something called mitigation, which is something similar to debate mitigation, but a little bit different. What the CFIUS can do, and this is something that's not just true in the US actually, this is true in many countries, even the most quote unquote free market countries that exist, because everyone cares about their national security. Through the CFIUS mitigation, the CFIUS has the ability, or I would say the authority, to be able to impose any agreement, to be able to impose any condition, or to be able or to order any party that is involved in like in a deal that could potentially lead to national security risk. So they can basically enter, like for example, there's an American company, there's a foreign company, they're trying to have a deal amongst themselves. The US government can already kind of enter inside that deal and impose certain restrictions on both of them, or impose certain restrictions on the deal itself to ensure whether it goes through or does not go through. So in effect, what it's kind of like is that the US government doesn't like always just keep interfering, but um, there are, I mean, I'll come to the rule book in a second, but there are also certain unwritten rules that exist that, for if you're a company and you don't want the government to enter your deal and interfere in your deal, you have to basically stay within certain lines and you have to color within the lines. These are the unsaid things that exist, which is a threat of regulation, which is that, and this is the biggest thing that exists in the US, which is that regulations are often not enforced, but the threat of regulation often ensures compliance because people are scared of regulation because it will lead to losing profits, it will lead to fines. But in practice, when they do exercise this mitigation in and enter any kind of deal, they basically enforce a binding rule book that both parties basically have to follow so that the deal can take place. And this rule book basically has very basic stuff like you have to have compliance officers from the government gets to audit some stuff, the government gets to say that okay, you can only reveal X amount of data with this foreign company, you can only have like one Chinese person on the board of directors, whatever. And these are conditions that the companies have to agree with in order to execute the transactions. But note, this only happens when this mitigation is happening. In most cases, what the CFIUS actually does is, again, the threat is bigger than the actual execution. Let's talk about export controls. You should know what export controls are. This is also what the US does with regards to sensitive industries and strategic sectors, is that there are rules that exist, and I personally don't remember which laws and stuff they were, but there are certain rules that exist in the United States that limit sharing certain technologies abroad, selling certain things abroad. So it's not just hardware. Um, okay, it's also kind of hardware. I'll give you an example, okay? And this is a completely hypothetical example, I promise. Um, let's say the entire world has access to ChatGPT 5.2. Let's say OpenAI has developed ChatGPT 5.3, 5.4, 5.5, and they're entering into a deal with some foreign entity, and they're saying that, okay, for the rest of the world, they have access to 5.2. I will give you 5.5. Uh, there are export controls in the United States that, in many cases, can prevent them from doing this, from not offering the best possible hardware. I mean, ChatGPT isn't hardware, but like not offering the best possible tier of the service that you have to certain foreign countries or to companies associated with certain foreign countries. You often withhold tools. You often also withhold technical assistance, like if something goes wrong. So this is what we mean by export controls. So the standard understanding of export controls is obviously true that you're trying to limit the net amount of stuff you're sending outside of your country. But this is not just to do with hardware stuff; it's also software stuff. Um, there's also the Defense Protection Act. This is something that I did not already know, but I researched and I found the name of this thing, which is basically that whenever the United States government feels that uh, there is the potential of a bottleneck in a strategic subsector of the military industrial complex, this specific act allows for the United States government to be able to scale up the amount of investment that it has into domestic production capacity. The whole Trump America first thing. So if the administration or if Congress feels that the risk of bottlenecks causing disruptions is too high, they can sanction a lot of money that they can spend into domestic capacity and be less dependent on foreign countries. Last thing that I want to talk about when we cover US policy tools that already exist are chips, incentives, and guardrails. Chips is a chips, you know what the full form of chips is? Let me remember. It's something like creating helpful incentives to protect semiconductors or to produce semiconductors, something like that. Like they came up with the acronym because it sounded cool, but basically it deals with chips, right? So the first thing that they do is that they expand, they invest a lot of money into building indigenous semiconductor capacity, but also there are the things that I was talking about, certain countries of concern, China, Russia, Iran, but also that this is a list that keeps changing with the Trump administration. But the progress that you're making in terms of making better and better chips, making better and better technology products, these are even if there are certain deals that are being made between American companies and foreign companies, the best of the best are not allowed to be shared through the chips guardrails, but they also provide incentives. They give subsidies and stuff. They give cheap loans. Okay, now let's head to the next thing. Let's talk about the fourth thing. So the next thing I want to talk about is international context. I won't go too deep into any country. What I basically want to explain is how whether this golden share. I mean, the answer is yes. but whether this golden share thing has precedence internationally outside of the US, and how do various countries treat their strategic industries. So Italy has something that's called golden power. This is not something that's exercised too often, but what it does is that it lets the state. It's similar to the veto thing that we talked about, in the sense that it can allow the state to block deals, but also that's not usually the state's incentive. They usually reshape deals and try to get more investment into their country. It's just that they try to fine tune how they get it. The UK has had different practice in the past, where they had special arrangements in a case by case situation. So, for example, when the United Kingdom was selling off a lot of its nationalized industries, it retained certain special agreements, not veto powers, but agreements to allow it to exert a certain amount of influence in those now newly privatized industries. Now, what the UK does is that they have general screening for certain types of acquisitions or for certain types of mergers and that kind of stuff. That you have to pass that screening. Like, it's just a test. Like, it's like an audit. And if you pass the checklist, you're golden. It's usually not specific interference that they do. Brazil is a special case because it the level of power that they try to exert using these golden shares is significant, not just in terms of the deals that Brazilian companies make abroad. So yeah, unlike the previous examples we've talked about, it's not just about how Brazilian companies engage with foreign companies, but also these special shares in Brazil allow for the Brazilian state to be able to make internal management related changes when they feel in these strategic industries, or to not really make those changes but to shape those changes, more specifically by blocking those changes, by blocking the creation of certain new departments or the eradication of certain new departments, or by blocking certain CEO changes and board of director changes and that kind of stuff, if they believe that that's a threat to their national identity. So the amount of interference that they're actually doing in their companies is higher, but it's more targeted towards the structure of the company inside the strategic sector itself, rather than how it's like its communication with the outside world, or its trade with the outside world and other companies. And China, we all know China. Like, I mean, uh, even if you don't have spec, you would assume that China has a lot of influence. But the idea is that China doesn't claim to have a lot of influence, so they usually have small stakes in a bunch of these industries and in a bunch of these companies in the strategic industries. One thing to note is that a lot of these companies are either directly owned by the Chinese state or owned by the Chinese state through proxy. The ones that are not, where the Chinese state only claims to have, like, say, a small amount of stake, uh, they usually end up using that small amount of stake as as a facade to be able to make significant changes inside companies. The Chinese government is famously and popularly very paranoid about data leakage. They're very paranoid about challenges to their authority and the functioning of their country. So the amount of power that they exert through these companies is also high. Uh, the main thing that I wanted to explain is that all of these systems are different, and all of these systems have potentially different, they have different extents to which they are controlling these companies and interfering in these companies, but B, there's also different ways in which they're interfering and controlling these companies, by controlling the organizational structure and the management of that company, or by shaping the deals themselves, or by vetoing certain deals, or by setting a bare minimum, say, threshold that you maybe have, or a filter that you have to pass through in order to be able to make foreign deals if you're a strategic industry company. So there is precedence for this kind of interference in strategic industries, but it varies. And yeah, now what I want to do is I want to spend some time talking about the American people as consumers, because the misconception that a lot of us are debating, but especially those of us from the developing world, speaking of myself in India, but of many of us in the developing world, have of American consumers, is that American consumers want quality above all else. American consumers want luxury goods that are super duper ultra luxurious. and they're willing to pay top dollar for it and all of that kind of stuff, and everyone's just drowning in money. These are, I mean, of course, this is something that is not unfair for us to say in these from our third world countries, because it does kind of seem that way when you look at it from our eyes. But if we are being a bit more nuanced and a bit more objective about this, historically, the revealed preferences of Americans have, especially in the information age, especially in the digital age, have shown that the American consumer really just wants three things. They want stuff to be affordable, yes, contrary to what we believe. They want stuff to be available. So the way that Americans expect convenience is, and I'm sorry to any Americans if I'm making any untrue assumptions, but the way that most Americans expect convenience to materialize in their life, or quote unquote luxury to materialize in their life, is to not have a lack of something, which is to have predictable systems that operate in predictable ways, to have predictable supply chains that operate in those predictable ways, so that they are able to get a constant stream of whatever they want. If I'm an American and I walk into Walmart, um, I might expect to get Fruit Loops, and more often than not, I will get those Fruit Loops. And when I don't get Fruit Loops, even if there's a more fancy, more expensive cereal that's there that might be more appealing, I will be a little angry that I did not get a constant availability of the product that I want. And the third thing that Americans want is reliability. The one thing that I would say in terms of consumer behavior that has not supported this very strongly is is the tendency of Americans to keep upgrading iPhones. But I don't think this is unique to Americans. And in most other fields, not fields, but in terms of most other products and services, Americans want whatever they're using to be consistently reliable. Again, all of these three things are pointing to something. In a developed country, in what we in debate call a Western liberal democracy, or a WLD, people don't just want to live ultra hedonistic lives. All people aren't just living in penthouses. They're normal people. They're doing jobs. Yes, they are economically more privileged, and have higher expectations. But those higher expectations usually manifest themselves as expecting something to be convenient. If I'm an American, I start my car, I want it to just work. I don't want to be in a situation where it does not work. So I want to go into a bit more detail on this, because I want to explain how the American people are consumers of either the products that these strategic industries develop themselves, but also how they're affected as consumers whenever there is a disruption in the bottlenecks that we were talking about in these strategic industries. So in daily life, strategic industries show up through prices and timing. In the sense that, again, the fact that there is a disruption at any point in the supply chain of a strategic industry might not be very visible to the American, or might not be front page news in the New York Times, but it does end up trickling down into things like the costs of vehicles and the availability of vehicles. When you book a car, how long do you have to wait for it? The timelines of construction, how long does it take for a specific building or something to be built? The replacement cycles of appliances, as I talked about, the iPhone thing, and the repair speed and maintenance speed of public infrastructure like roads and highways and various other things. But also, now that we have brought NVIDIA into this debate, a lot of digital services, even just most regular websites that you actually end up using, but even more complicated services, banking services, matrimonial services, more anything I can think of, increasingly depend on cloud computing capacity. The reason for this is that because cloud computing has become so much more popular, it is not economically very viable for any company in any industry to usually have physical servers or physical storage of their own data. They usually depend on cloud computing or cloud storage. Cloud storage to be able to run their websites and stuff. Sorry, cloud computing to run their websites and have a constant interface and all that stuff. And cloud storage to store data of themselves, of their users, all that stuff. If the capacity of cloud computing changes because chip production is delayed or whatever, this leads to an increase in subscription prices. This I'm trying to explain how the disruptions in the supply chain can actually become visible to an average consumer in America. It shows up as the reliability of a service, like if there is, I don't know, some online service that you rely on. What's the service you could rely on? Netflix. Maybe you rely on Netflix every day to be able to watch something with your meal. If there are major disruptions in the supply chain, maybe there will be more times that Netflix will be, I don't know, showing you an error 404 or something like that. But this is more true of services with smaller customer bases that aren't so big that they can't fail. But also, it shows up in the cost of government IT. So, if the state has to spend a higher amount of money, where do they recoup it? Taxes, they take it from you. Business IT, if the company, if any company has to spend a higher amount of money into, again, developing cloud computing capacity, and not developing but using cloud computing capacity, paying higher amounts of money for their cloud computing capacity, then they will pass those costs onto you as the consumer, or they will withhold a certain proportion of your salary as an employee. But I'll come to the workers thing in the next section. So the supply disruption is not likely to like lead to a Great Depression or something like that. Even though that's kind of like maybe how it sounded when I was being so dramatic about bottlenecks earlier. But these supply disruptions are actually felt by Americans as the absence of convenience. The convenience that they really, really want is something that they aren't able to get whenever these disruptions happen. And the actions that they have to take, which are like personally harmful actions to them, are things like having to wait for stuff, things like having to choose what to buy rather than being if there are three things I want to buy, then I'll have to choose that I can only buy two things this month, and the third thing I'll have to buy next month, and they have to ration out their money and stuff. Or there's cancelled projects that different companies have, or like the cancelled infrastructure development projects that the state has and stuff like that. So it's not usually going to be in the news that, I don't know, like palladium isn't as available as it used to be. But you will still feel the effects of this anyway. And this is all very important because for the vast majority of Americans, their household budgets become very sensitive to these kinds of shocks, such as when your energy bills increase, such as when your food prices increase, all of these, like car prices, rent, all of this stuff that increases. When industrial policies end up when industrial policies end up leading to a higher risk of disruptions at bottleneck points, then people start to understand that there is something that's wrong, which influences your ordinary political judgment. And again, just as I've been explaining, all Americans fundamentally want, like this is the TLDR, is they want convenience, they want a fair price. This is something that's been historically, empirically reflected by purchasing choices in America that constantly favor low cost supply chains, even when there are potentially strategic concerns, because Americans are at their core, they're willing to at least to a certain extent trade away losses to national security and all of those things for a higher amount of convenience. And honestly, I can't blame the Americans for it, right? Like this is something all of us do every day, just at like maybe a smaller scale. Like the using Instagram and saying yes whenever any website asks you if it's okay for them to be able to send you cookies is the convenient thing for you to do, even though you know it's collecting data on you and selling it to data brokers and to various other advertisers who are going to use that data in malicious ways against you. You are willing to value that convenience over that kind of small loss that you're making towards like your individual sovereignty. Americans are mostly willing to make that same kind of trade-off. Which is why earlier in the session, if you remember, in the spec illiterate approach, we asked ourselves, do Americans really truly know what is in their best interest? And this is a question that you have to answer in this debate. Here is a couple of examples that I've mentioned. When there was a bit of an inflation spike in 2022, everyone was talking about how expensive gas has become. Everyone was talking about how grocery bills have become too high, and all of that kind of stuff. More importantly than that, something that's more related to the motion, which is the 2021 to 2022 chip shortage. The way that this manifested in the American economy was that there were fewer new cars available with dealerships on lots. There were, like as I said, you had to wait for a longer period after booking a car to be able to get the specific car that you wanted to have. And in the meantime, the cost of used cars and second-hand cars was also increasing, which made that also accessible. Even though most buyers did not know which chip is missing, which bottleneck has had a disruption or whatever, they still ended up facing these effects, and they ended up blaming someone. Who do they blame? Well, that's something we'll come to later. Now, the next thing, the American people as workers. Also, if the session is too long, which I have a feeling that it might be, please feel free to view it in parts. But I do think that going in depth this way is actually quite useful. Okay, the American people as workers. Uh, this is the second layer through which Americans are able to interact with the economy. The first, as I explained, is as consumers, as the end point in a supply chain. The second is as labor, as a contributor to that supply chain. The American people as workers also affect this. And of course, when we talk about the interests of the American people, we are also talking about the interests of American people that work in the strategic industries, but also other industries that these industries can affect. Let's get into it. So, as I've already explained, steel as well as materials work is often place bound because you build plants, then you have communities that get anchored around these plants, and the unions and stuff end up having a lot of, I mean, they have a lot of stakes attached with whatever ends up happening to that particular plant. Secondly, in terms of high-end chip design, as we talked about earlier, this design work specifically that a lot of chip leaders are currently working on usually ends up clustering and becoming more concentrated in specific few metropolitan areas. And I mean, I don't really think that this is as important, but uh, I think that this is definitely an avenue of this debate, which is immigration patterns, which is that the American workers are always influenced by immigration patterns. Even workers in Silicon Valley are influenced by immigration patterns, especially because most skilled immigration actually goes to the IT sector. So the workers in these sectors immediately end up getting influenced by whatever ends up happening. Also, when it comes to firm labor mobility, because as I said, this is something that's not very true for steel, because steel and these material sciences work and stuff, all of the manufacturing side of the chip building, but also of steel, is place bound because you build your facility in a particular place. But this work is the more service related, more software related, more design related work. This is not very like location centric. It just happens to be location centric. Nothing really too unique about Silicon Valley. Anyway, the idea is that if there is enough competition in the market for the American workers to be able to go to, if they're able to have a certain amount of leverage in their own company and they're able to say that, hey, if you don't treat me well, I will leave your company and go to another company. This is something that would be in the interests of the American worker. Also, I want to note that whenever there are workforce constraints, like the supply shortage of skilled labor in America also ends up becoming a bottleneck, which can either increase the burden on these kinds of workers, but also it can increase the importance of these kinds of workers. So, tool technicians, machinists, process engineers, blah blah blah. These types of workers are very very important in the functioning of the supply chain, and they're especially important because they take years and years to train and certify. If you're learning a trade, then it requires a trade at this high level to be able to handle things of such high stakes in these strategic sectors. Then it takes many, many years and many hurdles and many licenses and certificates that you have to get. Again, this is also a constraint in the operation of the company, but this is also something that's important if you're trying to analyze the interests of the American people as workers. You should also understand that workers aren't always directly affected by, like, just like customers, workers are also not always directly affected by the disruptions at the bottleneck points. What they do is they make up their mind and they formulate opinions based on signals that these companies give, and those signals are inherently tied to the existence or disruption, the existence of disruptions or the lack thereof at these bottleneck points. So, for example, if maintenance cycles are functioning, if maintenance cycles are regular, if they're not getting unnecessarily postponed, if modernization plans are actually going through, if whatever a site is treated as a core site that is going to be maintained or a marginal site that could be put up on the chopping block or whatever, these are all signals through which workers evaluate whether the company is doing well or not, but they also evaluate their own position and their own importance within the company. And as I already said, trade unions are very, very important in terms of shaping the activities of heavy industries, but also politicization does not just exist at the level of trade unions, it also exists on the level of state and local governments. So the people end up choosing certain people to represent them, and then those people, like we already talked about in terms of the chips act, right, like the helpful investment blah blah act, um providing positive incentives, providing negative incentives to all of these industries and stuff like that. So, but the idea is that these state and local governments are often I mean, not often. They're of course elected by people, but the representatives of these specific areas where these plants are there or where these hi-fi offices exist, the representatives of those particular areas promise to deal with the concerns of the specific people in those areas. So they often end up treating like trade unions and stuff as vote banks, and also they engage in corporate lobbying with the firm that is hiring the people that make up the trade union. So the government also has to kind of balance a bunch of different things. It has to balance the interests of the people that have lobbied them to power. They have to balance the interests of the people that have voted them to power. But also on some tertiary level, they also balance the interests of the state in the long term. Let's give you a couple of examples. So in regions like in Western Pennsylvania, Northwest Indiana, where trade unions are really, really strong and are quite commonplace, workers often watch capital spending signals, such as whether blast furnaces are getting relined or not, or whether planned EAF upgrades are actually moving forward or not, because that actually tells them whether a site is going to be treated as long term. If you're trying to comply with within the environmental regulations, if you're with this particular site, if you're maintaining the apparatus or the machinery or the infrastructure that exists at this particular site, this is a signal to the workers that yes, we care about this site. But also, the second example, when big projects ramp up, the labor market tightens in specific places. For example, in Intel's Ohio build out and in TSMC, which is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company's Arizona project, both of these projects have pulled a lot of demand for, again, the types of people I was talking about, people who are well versed in a trade at a high level, electricians, pipe fitters, tool technicians. So what this meant was when there is an entry of any kind, not an entry, but an initiation of any kind of project which requires very, very skilled labor and demands that skilled labor, that obviously ends up affecting the prices of that skilled labor across just that plant, apart from just that plant, beyond just that plant. Even though, let's say I am TSMC and I am looking to hire like very, very qualified electricians and I'm willing to pay top dollar for them. Just because I, as TSMC, I am willing to pay top dollar for electricians, this means that the expected wages that electricians have in this entire region of Arizona, wherever the project was inside Arizona, I don't know, probably Phoenix, who knows, but uh, in that particular region, the expected wages of all of these people, of all the people who are involved in these trades that we're demanding, are also going to go up. So this is why we need to divide the incentives of or the interests of the American people into two different levels. The most common way to approach this motion would be to just treat the American people as consumers, because that is very strong stereotype that we in third world hold about Americans, about consume culture, which is true again to an extent. But we also have to understand their roles in the supply chain, and we also have to understand the kinds of interests that they hold in the supply chain, in these strategic industries, so that we're able to analyze the interplay between the state interfering in these industries and what kind of impacts it would have on the employees, not just those people. Now, no, this we've already done. Enough talking. Let's do case making. Now, we've already done the spec illiterate approach. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to try to use spec to be able to make case. Okay. I'm going to give you two example impacts that I was able to generate with the spec. The stuff that I knew, at least, like I couldn't figure out the what to do with the American military purchasing thing, because I don't know, it seems kind of symmetric to me. Anyway, so how we have to use spec. How do we use spec? Uh, let's just TLDR this whole session, okay? Or at least TLDR this entire part of this session. If you weren't paying attention, or if you just skipped past all the spec explanation, that's fine. Let's just figure out what we have actually learned through all of this. There are a few things that we have gleaned about the state, the companies, and the people from our discovery of America. The first is, what is a strategic industry? We figured out that strategic means a choke point. If it breaks, a lot of other things break, and fixing it takes many, many years. Secondly, we figured out that chips, magnets, and steel behave differently. Chips move fast and rely on global networks. Magnets and steel move slow and depend on big physical sites that have follow-on impacts to the people that exist around those sites. We also talked about what status quo is kind of like. So the US already interferes in these strategic sectors using CFIA US, using export controls, using the CHIPS rules. I'm sorry, this acronym will never stop being funny to me. And defense contracting. Then we talked about signaling. We basically talked about how disruptions at these bottlenecks, at these choke points, can actually trickle down to Americans in two different ways. So, first, we figured out how Americans judge the economy through what they feel, through things like price increases, through things like waiting times increasing, through things like outages of common services, through things like shutting down of local plants that you or your family might be dependent on because you work there. We also talked about how steel and also to a certain extent chip production is not chip production, but at least the material sides part. There's a lot of local politics which also ends up becoming something uh, of a bottleneck because unions exert a large amount of pressure because the families of those unions, the dependents of those unions, and all of those people make up the majority of the towns where this plant exists, and these their interests and their opinions are usually different than what people away from these places might feel, but also they are more impactful in these areas than whatever the general public opinion might be. We also considered that, I mean, we haven't done this yet. I will come to this, that the people are also investors. I do want you to know this. I haven't come to this yet, but when we talk about the interests of the people, the people also refers to the people who are investing in these companies, but also many households who are tied to big companies through 401ks and stuff. I'll come to this in a second. Uh, let's go ahead. Companies often route around rules when they can. They probably restructure deals. These are basically the existing modes through which companies try to skirt regulations and try to, play cat and mouse with the state. They restructure deals. They use shell corporations. They use subsidiaries. They instead of having mergers and acquisitions, they switch to licensing certain products. They have joint ventures and stuff. But also, the United States has a lot of influence across the world because whatever happens in the US, whether it's an actual tool or a policy tool, ends up becoming, I don't know, more commonplace around the world. People and other countries copy these tools, becoming normal, and or then they use these same tools in deals the United States makes. Uh, what are some questions that Gov must answer? Considering all of this spec, now that hopefully you know the spec, how do you come up with the right sorts of questions to answer that can lead to certain impacts? And I want you to compare these questions to the questions we asked earlier, because these questions were much simpler. What is the signaling to foreign investors? Are foreign investors going to be more or less comfortable? What is the number of markets? How will these people react? How will these people react? And this, state good, state bad, corporate good, corporate bad, right? Now the questions are also going to get a little bit more complicated, but it's not the questions that are complicated. It's just again, the moving parts of the motion that are attached to the question that are complicated. First, which company moves, when I say company moves, I mean like actions that the company takes, are the real choke point moves. Is it selling of key assets? Is it moving capacity from one place to another? Is it transfer of technology? Is it changing control and giving it to foreign companies or countries? And which moves are mostly noise? This question, the answer to this question is going to give you the delta-ish of this debate. What do I mean by this? This debate is about the United States government getting golden shares where they can exercise veto powers and stuff. When are they actually going to exercise veto powers? Companies take a large number of decisions, which is an understatement. The United States government is probably not going to interfere in every single one of the decisions that the company takes. So they are probably going to ascertain, and you as a team in this debate should be trying to ascertain which are the moves that or which are the actions that the company takes that are either prone to, say, creating these bottlenecks or to solving these bottlenecks, or just are the actions themselves are the bottlenecks that can lead to more and more disruptions if it's a repeated kind of action. Second, which firms actually count as strategic, given that some bottlenecks sit in suppliers rather than famous brand names? So it might be very, very obvious when we think of strategic industries to say things like, oh, health is a strategic industry, education is a strategic industry, and blah blah blah. This is not necessarily that true. but also we might be biased towards saying something like, I don't know, Google is a strategic industry, which it is. Or Amazon is a strategic industry, maybe, which is also true, which they are. But if we keep trying to go for the big companies, we end up missing out on the sorts of companies that make up the bulk of the companies inside strategic industries. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is, if your supply chain is this long, okay, and this is the big company that is finally doing the order or whatever, what a lot of people would assume in this debate is that the interference that the state would have and the golden veto that they would, golden share that they would buy, would only be in this big company. But now that we have understood that in these strategic sectors, even the entire supply chain is what makes the sector strategic and prone to like potential disruptions, it is likely that the state tries to get like this kind of golden shares in not all, but in the most important parts of this supply chain. So it is not likely that the state is going to limit this just to the top companies, just to the alphabets or whatever. Third, when does the US in status quo use these kinds of controls, CFIUS or export controls? First, you have to answer that. Then, as a consequence of proposition, the US is going to have an option. They can either use their existing stuff, such as CFIUS or export controls or giving subsidies through CHIPS Act and stuff, or they can use this golden share. So when we talked about, if you remember, eons ago, we were talking about us having to figure out how is this acquisition of golden shares actually going to happen? What is the most likely way in which this acquisition of golden shares is actually going to happen? After learning all of this spec is when we are able to come up with potentially better, like a more nuanced version of that kind of question that actually fulfills the burden of proving the most likely way in which this happens, which is that the United States has gotten one extra tool in their toolbox, but their old tool has not gone away. So in which actual sorts of deals is this going to be used? Like I said, in which company moves? But in a lot of these company moves, that even if the ones that we are, a lot of the company moves that are the answer to question number one, that are the real choke point moves. A lot of those choke point moves can also be addressed by the state using CFIUS, using chips, using export controls. When would it actually choose to use the inside the company tool like a golden share, taking influence from other countries outside? Fourth, what does public interest actually look like in real life? We're talking about the interests of the American people. So, like I said, it's about wanting as much convenience as possible. It's about wanting job stability if you are the worker, but also retirement savings, which is something I'm constantly hinting at because it's a part of an impact that I thought of. Lastly, of course, this is not a non-exhaustive list, goes without saying, but still, lastly, how does this enforcement actually work in practice? Uh, who is the person or who is the agency or subpart who's going to spot this trigger? Who's going to report it? Who's going to check if the company is actually being compliant with the regulations? And what happens in the case of conflict? In my opinion, even if you don't answer this entire, I don't know why I'm not able to. Yeah, that. Okay. Even if you don't answer the entire first part of this question, which is who spots the trigger, who reports it, who checks compliance, blah, 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 you should at least ask yourself what happens when there is a dispute. What happens when the state says do X and the company says do Y? Or what happens when the state says that you have committed a violation and the company says, no, we have not committed a violation? The obvious answer is litigation, but there's probably some other means and other things that are also likely to happen apart from litigation, not mitigation. Uh, Now let's come to a couple of impacts that I think government can prove and the logical chain that can actually be followed to lead to those impacts. Again, what we are specifically trying to prove here is um, the betterment of the or the fulfillment of the interests of the American people. Impact number one. I think that passing proposition would lead to fewer sudden shocks that would be noticeable in the lives of families and would disrupt their household economy. And what is the sort of logical chain that can lead to this impact? First, the state can get a golden share. It covers a small list of, not a small list of companies, but a small list of specific big high impact company actions. This is a signal to the companies themselves. So if the government has said that, okay, my golden share is going to allow me to exert control if you do A, B, and C, then the companies in their planning process treat actions A, B, and C as actions that require permission and will have scrutiny. So they are likely to account for that in their planning of their business operations. What this means is that the deals and the plans and the moves that they're trying to make, it's likely that they just want to avoid ever having to be in a situation where the state actually uses that golden share at all. So they end up making deals and they end up making moves and end up taking actions that don't trigger regulatory authority from the states. For example, you could keep a key unit in the US. For example, sudden changing of the timeline, or suddenly changing a partner, or again, the board of directors example that I gave you of adding someone from a quote unquote sensitive country to your board of directors. So companies themselves might probably end up avoiding these sorts of high risk sorts of actions, not just because they are high risk actions, because that's something they already don't care about, right? Like they have to, they've always known that these are high risk actions. They've been taking these actions anyway. But state intervention is a big enough deterrent for them to actually be able to plan around these high risk actions to either not execute them or execute them better. What this means is that, let's say nothing actually changes. Let's say companies still end up taking these same sorts of actions, such as changing partners, changing timelines, or whatever. My claim here is that they would do it in a slower and in a more planned out way, so that no part of the supply chain or no part of the decision chain or the implementation chain or whatever action they're trying to take is going to create a need for the United States to be able to use its veto powers and stuff. So the slowness of this kind of process is something that I would say is good, because the slowness of this process reduces the chances of sudden moves that are usually driven by ownership, that either shrink the supply of a good or a service that the United States might have or shift it elsewhere. Like any kind of big move, such as a merger or an acquisition that a company is taking part in, or some foreign company is buying this company, or some company is suddenly losing a lot of production capacity or whatever. These quick, ill-planned out moves, or the moves which I don't, again, are the most likely to trigger the US using their golden veto power or whatever. We think that these moves are probably going to be way slower. We think they're going to be way more staggered, and we are going to try to uh, do this in the most minimalist sort of way, in the sense that you're not minimalist, but you want to cause the minimum amount of harm to the American economy. Because if you show that you're going to cause a big harm to the American economy or risk a big harm to the American economy, the state is going to come in with its golden share and is going to start getting all up in your business and exposing other stuff that maybe you don't want exposed and all. So these sudden moves that either suddenly shrink the supply of anything that the US has, or suddenly change the base of production of something in the US, sudden shifts in the supply chain, this probably reduces. What this means is now downstream buyers, not the customers, but buyers in the supply chain that I'm talking about, people like people who make cars, people who work in utilities, people who supply raw materials and various like implements and apparatuses for construction, they are uh, in less of a position where they have to scramble for alternatives. They are remember when we were talking about the interests of the American people and the expectations of the American people, that they want reliability above all else. If someone wants reliability above all else, the smallest violation of that reliability is going to lead to panic and paranoia. This panic is what affects pricing the most, is what actually creates shocks and magnifies the small disruptions that are happening at the bottleneck to affect a large number of people and a large number of industries. When you suddenly get into a panic situation that, oh my God, I don't have XYZ raw material, or oh my God, this XYZ supply chain has suddenly had such a massive shift. I don't know if I'm going to be able to meet my quotas for this quarter or for the next quarter or for the next 4 quarters or whatever. Instead of this, I need to suddenly find a quick alternative. In these sorts of moments where these panic decisions are made is where the chances of disruptions blow up, and the chances of a small disruption blowing up into a big disruption blows up. So what we are able to do is we are able to prevent the likelihood of this kind of harm. Why is this harm bad? This harm is bad because it directly affects the American people. So households feel this through stuff that they're actually able to see. On our side, there are fewer empty lots in car dealerships. On our side, there are fewer sudden markups. On our side, things are repaired more consistently. The projects end up not getting delayed. All of these are benefits that come from the harm prevention thing. For example, in the 2021 to 2022 chip shortage, what people observed was, like I talked about earlier, was long waits, was higher new and used car prices. Even though they did not know what chip is missing, the panic and the scrambling for alternatives and stuff was what led to a blowing up of the chip shortage crisis, even beyond just the industry where the chips themselves are actually used. So we first proved that this is a massive harm, and then we are able to prove that we're able to prevent this. I am not, again, this is just, I do want to point out though, I am not really making a full case here. I'm not telling you why golden shares will happen in good ways and blah, 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 and why they will be efficacious to do this. These are downstream impacts once you have done all of the setup with your spec or with your speculated approach, whatever. Once you've done all of your setup and proven your premises, you should be able to try to prove some impacts like this. Impact number 2 for Gov. I think that there's going to be more stable domestic capacity and slow to rebuild industries, because we're talking about these strategic industries where like any kind of small disruption takes many, many years to unravel and like reverse and stuff. We think that we're able to have a higher amount of stability. Again, on Gov, in this motion, I would basically try to argue that the state is going to use this power in a good way, of course, but also the existence of the this unique power with the state is going to lead to better and better impacts among all of the companies in these strategic industries that might be taking irrational decisions otherwise, or just because, and now they won't because they're scared of regulation. So the what is the chain that leads to the second impact? First, we think that, like I said, what does this golden share cover? Plant closure, blah 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 blah, shifting abroad. And once again, these decisions become harder to do without clearing the consent step. Like I said, companies treat these decisions as they put them in a separate box that, okay, for this we'll have to probably get permission. This means that negotiations between different companies end up happening earlier. And this is like a different case of my first impact. My first impact says that you will either slow down the decisions that you make or prevent stupid decisions. Like if you were going to make 10 decisions, now you're going to think to yourself, out of those 10 decisions, I'm very worried about the kind of regulation that I might have to face. Okay, let me try to find the three most stupid decisions out of these 10, and I will take 7 decisions instead. This is the impact. This is the first impact. But in the second impact, I am saying that these decisions probably will still happen, but people know that we can't take these decisions very, very fast, because we know that, okay, yeah, as a company, as NVIDIA, if I want to take this kind of decision, I know that in the future, I will probably have to clear the consent step. It's going to be a long and drawn out process. If I know that I'm not going to be able to quickly make these decisions, I will make these decisions, and I will make these decisions in a more planned way, in the sense that I will account for the extended time period that this decision is going to require. And because I have to adjust to this long time period, I do better things. For example, I begin my negotiations earlier, I do them more intensely, and I ensure that whatever commitments I make in those negotiations, whatever deals I make to whatever partner that I have, are things that I actually live by, because these deals are now linked directly to the ability of the US government to increase the amount of interference that they have in my company. So I make sure that I am as compliant as I can be, and just in the pursuit of trying to appear compliant, I end up actually being quite compliant. Because I mean, in the pursuit of wanting to appear compliant, to not appear non-compliant, I end up doing more compliance. What does this mean? This means that things that are very, very slow to rebuild, such as mills, such as a bunch of things I talked about in the steps of building magnets, such as separation lines, we think that the pathways towards the building of these things, like I said, the supply chains are very long, the time expectations are very long. We think that even if the supply chain and the time expectation remains as long, the issue that we had with the time lengthening thing earlier in this session was that if the time is very long, the chances of uh, more bottlenecks getting created is higher, and the risk of disruption at each bottleneck is also something that is higher. Now, I am more consistent and more planned across this entire long time because I already expect that it will take a long time, because it's not just the length of the actual supply, the length that the supply chain necessitates, it's also the length of the compliance procedure or whatever that I will eventually have to, like the regulatory procedure or whatever that I will eventually have to comply with. So the case is just this, that companies already expect that processes will take time, but they think that we can take decisions fast, so it's okay if processes take time. The problem is quick decision making does not negate the long term issue of the supply of the project, right? Like the project is still a long term project. Now, the additional thing that companies have to worry about, which forces them to really accept the reality that, okay, this is a long term project, is the fact that uh, at a time that I actually invest in this project, eventually I will have to get state support or like state approval, and I have to ensure that the US government does not veto me. So, this additional time expectation that's added, this specific additional time expectation prevents sudden decision making, which prevents the chances of disruptions inside the supply chain. This is good, obviously, for the consumer because there are less shocks, so we can also kind of lead to the first impact. But more importantly, in this case, we think that this is good for the interests of the American people because, like we said, we are talking about the people who are also part of the supply chain. So suppliers, contractors, miners, all of these people are able to plan their operations better because sites are not changing very fast, because you're not worried that whatever you're planning for with regards to a specific plant that's near your place, like not near your place, whatever that's geographically proximate to you, whether you will actually be able to execute that planning or not. This lack of worry allows you to be able to make better plans as contractors. As contractors and suppliers, you have more stable streams of income. Communities also end up getting steadier paychecks, and they also end up having a more steady, and this is a downstream impact, which is that if they're getting more steady paychecks, this means that there's less fluctuation in the amount of taxes that they're paying, which funds roads, schools, and services. It might seem like a bit of an uncharitable impact to you because it might seem like I'm claiming something too big. But what I want to note is here I am not talking about funding like road, schools, and services like across the country. I'm talking about like funding road, schools, and services in uh, the towns that have sprung up around these plants that happen that have been built, and towns that inevitably end up springing up around the plants that exist or that get built or whatever. So, for example, in steel regions like Western Pennsylvania, blah 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 blah. Workers watch upgrades and modernization plans because it's an early sign of whether the site has a future. This signaling is useful. We talked about it earlier. But what I wanted to include in this example is tomorrow, if many of these plants begin to close, the time delay that it would take to rebuild the industry or to rebuild plants to cater to workers specifically trained for it. So, like we were talking about, very highly specialized workers or people who are part of trade unions who have been working in one plant for the entirety of their lives, who don't have all that many alternatives that they can jump to and stuff. Um, it is going to take a lot of time, which is something that's very bad for them. And at the same time, because these people have such specific skills and they're so, and even if those skills are not specific, just the longevity of how long they've been tied into a specific plant or something like that, to take these people and to place them in different industries or different parts of the same industry is something that is very difficult for the state to end up doing. So it is not in the state's interest to like constantly allow plants to keep getting like uprooted and shifted around the country and all of that kind of stuff. And even if they do need to close, it should not be a decision taken on a whim. It should be a decision that has a lot of thought put into it. And even the plan to close a factory and to relocate a factory, even inside the United States, should have a long plan, a long, slow, staggered plan. So people can also keep adapting to it. This long, slow, staggered plan will come because the management of these companies is going to fear compliance. These are the two impacts that I could come up with from Gov. Um, that avoids the spec illiterate impacting and the debate that we had in the spec illiterate part, while still utilizing the spec that we actually ended up learning. Let's go next. Now let's move on to op impacts. There's two impacts that I've been able to make utilizing the spec. Um, I will explain to you how these impacts actually work. The first impact is that uh, households are already exposed to these companies. My impact is actually a lower valuation of these companies, and the impact of that and the link of that to the interests of the American people is that their retirement savings get a little screwed. So, how does that happen? First, I think that markets will have to price in a new risk, and the new risk is the Trump administration, is the U.S. government, is the Trump administration, U.S. government going to say yes or no? And on op, I would not even assert that, oh, they're always going to say yes or they're always going to say no, or even that they're more likely to say yes or more likely to say no. I would hinge on the fact that their reaction is not predictable. And the fact that this reaction of the state and the state consent, whether it's going to come or not come, or state veto, whether it's going to come or not come, is so unpredictable, this means that there is a new risk that markets have to price in. What do we mean by markets pricing in a risk? So, uh, a common idea, not a common, an idea that basically forms the basis of modern capitalism is that we live in a world with a lot of uh, information, with a lot of goods and with a lot of services. So there is a lot of information. How I feel about ice cream is a piece of information. How Ugandan women feel about Starbucks is a piece of information. The number of Ford cars sold in the past 5 years is a piece of information. The idea is that the best representation of all of this information that our world has uh, is through stock price. That's literally it. The idea is that the best way to represent the complex ways in which societal information can interact and how certain positive information can account for certain negative information. For example, let's say that um, there is information that movie watching has gone up, cinema goers have gone up by 50% in the past 2 years. But also, there could be information that young adults are more increasingly more OTT friendly and don't want to go to theaters. This is an opinion poll. Both of these information pieces can be true at the same time. The only thing is that they have different weights to them. Uh, this is reflected in the price of the stock that is connected to this information. So the stock could be, I don't know, like uh, Netflix or Amazon stock or something like that, or like a stock of some, I don't know, some theater company like AMC or something in the US. I think AMC is a theater company. I'm not so sure. Um, but the idea is that these stock prices reflect the end weighed out quantum of all of that information. Uh, this is called the efficient market hypothesis. The idea is that whatever the price of any stock is at a given moment is the quote unquote correct price, because the market contains people that cumulatively have all sorts of information. The market contains insider traders. The market contains politicians. The market contains subject field experts. The market contains old people. The market contains young people, risk averse people. The market contains impulsive people. The market contains learned people. The market contains people who don't know enough about this stock but are buying it because of a trend. And therefore, they also are providing information, right? Like this trend is enough to motivate someone to buy the stock. So, uh, this is called the efficient market hypothesis. It's a hypothesis because it's imperfect. The market often shows signs of inefficiency in many different fields. Not different fields, but like in many different countries, markets can end up being inefficient for various ways, for various reasons. But anyway, the idea is that anytime there is a new piece of information, there is a new piece of data. Even if that information is a risk, that has to be priced in to the value of the stock of the company, and hence the market cap valuation of that company. What is a market cap valuation? A market cap valuation is the product of the stock price of a company multiplied by all the number of stocks that or number of shares that that company has issued. So Now the market has to price a new risk. This is a very big risk because and you can explain here why the Trump administration is very erratic and you don't know how it's going to behave. And especially you don't know how it's going to behave when it comes to firms that rely on international deals and partnerships, that have memoranda of understanding and have tie-ups and partners and suppliers in different countries, because you don't know how long Trump is going to like a country. You don't know when Trump will stop liking a country. You don't know what sorts of sanctions he's going to impose, how long sanctions will last, whether he will walk them back, whether he will not walk them back. I mean, taco is a meme, and but you never know, which is the whole idea. Uh, when there is a higher risk that the markets are now pricing in, investors are now going to ask, how does this pricing happen, right? Um, Investors will basically ask for an extra return to be able to hold that risk, whether it is your standard investors or whether it's someone who is giving money to this company through debt. So the two impacts so far of this are: number one, the stock price of this company is going to reduce, which means the market cap valuation of this company is going to reduce because there is an additional risk now. And the credibility of this company to be able to borrow money reduces, which means the cost of borrowing capital increases. What does that mean? That basically means that uh, whoever is giving this company debt feels that there is a higher risk that this debt might not be paid off, which means that they will charge a higher interest on this kind of debt. Which means that the cost of for the cost of acquiring capital for this cost of capital for this company is going to increase. Why does this matter? Why does it matter that these companies in strategic industries have to pay more money to get debt? And why does it matter that their stock prices are falling? It matters because these companies that are in strategic industries, they sit inside pension funds, they sit inside index funds, of course, but they also sit inside 401ks and, if I'm not mistaken, Roth IRAs. So what does this mean? This means that, for example, when there's a teachers' union that makes a collective pension fund, they invest that money that they've all pooled together, their pension fund, into what we call broad index exposure to get exposed to as many companies as possible. But a lot of these companies are usually in strategic industries because the idea is that they're going to provide reliable returns, because no matter what, these industries themselves are still going to be utile for America and necessary for America. So it's likely that over a long period of time, they probably don't go down. This is the logic for investing into these companies, for pension funds, for 401k managers, and all of that kind of stuff. But when the valuation of this company reduces, this also means that the valuation of your pension fund reduces. This means that the valuation of your potential pension withdrawal at a certain point is something that's going to reduce, which means that you probably, if you're 45 and you were planning to retire at 50, and you check your pension fund account or whatever, and you realize that because of this higher amount of risk, there is at least some drop in the value of my pension fund. What this means is you'll probably have to push back your retirement. This may seem like a stretch, but it's really not, because it is very, very common practice for because the whole purpose of pension funds is not to hold money at all. The purpose of, or even to invest in debt. The purpose of pension funds is to grow that money so they're able to provide pensions to as many people as possible consistently over a long period of time. So they're actually looking for growth. So they are willing to take a certain amount of risk. This is where the risk does not pay out, because the valuation of the company that the pension fund invested in, the company that's the strategic sector company, the valuation of this company reduces. This means that people have to push forward their retirement, or they have less money to retire. This means they have to work longer. This is one of the biggest harms that can potentially happen in the United States, especially, at least in my opinion, especially when there's already concerns around things like fertility rates. There's already concerns around, especially amongst Gen Z and millennials, there's concerns about whether they're even going to be able to retire or not, especially when state sanctioned welfare and support for the elderly and medical insurance seem like things that Trump is very, very determined to cut, and the Dems are very, very determined to probably not bring back, even if they do get into power. So this is a major concern, and an impact in which, and the way in which the interests of people are violated. It affects people's household budgets. It affects their planning for the future. It pushes them into a position because it's a signaling thing, right? So it pushes them into a position where they have to work for a longer period of time rather than enjoying their retirement. The second type of impact here, which is also a way in which your household budgeting gets affected, is that okay, when the cost of capital is higher, these strategic sector companies will often end up doing is they will slow down expansions. They will slow down hiring. They will tighten budgets for suppliers and like order more limited quantities from these suppliers. This harms the suppliers. This harms the people that could have gotten hired. This harms the communities where this expansion could have happened and jobs could have been created. So all of this is also a harm that comes out of low valuation and higher cost of capital. But I do think that the main harm here is a lower ability to retire, but also just a fear amongst people that maybe we will not be able to retire. Because even if my pension fund drops today and 3 months later it probably goes back up in value or whatever, in these 3 months I have probably made the decision that okay, I will have to work at this company for 5 more years. Okay, I can't rely on my pension fund to remain stable to allow me to retire at 50. I will have to work at longer. So what signaling as a mechanism, which is why I really, really like it as a mechanism, is able to do is signaling often increases the amount of impact, even if the direct impact that's created is not that high, because the people's perception of their impact actually shapes their actions. Let's talk about the second impact. And this is kind of like, remember when we were talking about the gov impacts, we said that decisions are made in a more slow way. And this is good because this means there are more rational decisions and that kind of stuff. Um, on op, I would argue that slow decisions mean slow growth, and these are costs that are ultimately passed down to the consumers, and the consumers have to pay high costs, but the improvements and innovation that is actually taking place in this industry or in this company is lower. So costs is higher as compared to the value that the customers are getting. Why is this true? And here I want to maybe zoom in a little bit on chips and cloud compute, because the idea is uh, for the chip supplier, for a chip designer, chip maker company, for like an NVIDIA, it is very important for you to have high speed, because there are so many people that are now trying to compete in this industry. There are so many people who are trying to enter this industry. There's so many VC funds and angel investors that are pouring money into people who claim that they will very easily be able to enter this industry from all around the world. That the client of these chip companies, and when I talk about clients, remember I was talking about like the phone company, or potentially like Google or whoever, um, any sorts of companies that rely on these chips, they require a steady and high speed of supply of chips. And if this is not guaranteed to them, then they are not completely likely but to completely take their like partner their business elsewhere, but they're going to dilute their business with you and your American firms and increase the business and increase the reliance on firms outside of America. Because for these partnerships between a chip supplier and a chip manufacturer and someone who requires that chip to be able to exist, the person who wants that chip fast. They want to ensure that it's not just that we're getting fast chips right now, but we want a commitment from the chip manufacturer or the chip supplier that you're going to be able to keep giving us this kind of inventory over a fixed period of time. But the problem is that when these like remember on gov we said that high impact decisions can take longer, so again people are more rational. Here we are saying that yes, this is true, high impact decisions take longer, firms pre-clear, they wait for certainty, we are conceding to gov to a certain extent. But the problem is that your partners, which is to say that the people that you're working with, like a phone company that wants to use your chips, or Google who wants to use your chips to fuel its own AI upgrades and stuff, it really does not want this kind of uncertainty, because it's not just about the risk that they are taking engaging with you by virtue of you being in this kind of sensitive strategic industry and all the bottleneck disruptions that can exist. That is a risk for sure. But the uncertainty of delivery and whether delivery will even happen or not, because decisions are not being made fast enough, can push them towards other suppliers, can push them towards other people. Because the idea is, if I'm a mobile phone company, for example, okay, and I say to my requirements to a chip company is I want 5,000 chips this year. I want 10,000 chips next year. And 2 years later, I want 10,000 chips of a next generation. This is important for me because I have to plan out my product based on integration of these chips. But also, my product upgrades are going to be contingent on chip upgrades to a certain extent. So, my planning as this mobile phone company is contingent on getting commitment on supply, commitment on capacity additions, so that I'm able to actually plan my own business plan or whatever. This is very, very true right now with chips because demand is surging, but the supply is not growing at the same rate. But everyone is trying to enter this field of like trying to supply chips. So even though supply is taking time to grow, there are so many actors that exist here. That so you're spoiled for choice. You want to go to the and try to get the best deal possible. You want to diversify and make sure all your eggs are not in the same basket and stuff like that. So the idea is that my uncertainty about whether this chip company is going to give me chips on time and will be able to upgrade their chips or will even be able to do business with me in the future or whatever. This additional uncertainty, this additional risk is going to reduce my business with this company and push me towards other people. But let's say that does not happen. Let's say there are no other people because NVIDIA is NVIDIA and I still have to keep trading with NVIDIA. Uh, what happens? What ends up happening is that instead of feeling this risk myself, as phone company or let's say as Google, when I'm trying to run Gemini and I'm trying to plan for Gemini 5 and I'm trained and all my coders are working on building an LLM for Gemini 5 or whatever. Um, but the chips aren't there to be able to support it and compute isn't there to be able to support it. This means that I will do one of few things. The first thing that I could do is I could pass the cost on to the consumer. This is one of the most common measures that businesses take when they take more risk. When they take more risk, they evaluate what the cost of that risk is and they pass it on to the consumers. The second is rationing. Because I have more limited money and because I'm quite scared about what might happen in the future, I might end up rationing what I'm actually giving out. What this looks like is a bunch of things. So it looks like the not necessarily just the pure demand of chips, but the demand of other raw materials that you are able to do. Stuff that we talked about earlier, things like expansion, things like creating more jobs. You probably don't do that. But more importantly and relevantly in this specific impact of fast moving sectors, you will probably end up slowing rollout of compute heavy features. Google could have Gemini 5 ready in terms of having a code base about Gemini 5 ready and the UI, UX and everything ready. But because it would require a lot of compute, that is to say that it would require a lot of computational power, it would require a lot of chips to be able to do that. And the quantity of chips is not there to support it. And the quality of chips in terms of like the innovation and the upgradation of chips is also not happening, which means that even if I do have Gemini 5, I will end up rolling it out much slower. I'll probably restrict it to like the most privileged people who can pay me the maximum money for it. Or maybe I will put like usage caps on people and that kind of stuff, right? So that's how households actually feel it. They will feel it through paying subscription fees. They'll feel it through the reliability of the services, whether how long ChatGPT ends up being down every day. But most importantly, they will feel it through slower improvement in everyday digital services. And we talked about this. Americans want reliability and most importantly, they want convenience. In a world that's growing increasingly more dependent on AI, people's standards and expectations of that AI are also increasing. So let's take an example. First, there are high compute prices. Okay, high compute prices because of chip shortage, and more than chip shortage, high compute prices because of uncertainty and risk in the existence of long-term deals with chip companies. What this leads to is first high cloud prices and cloud hosting prices, but also low capacity limits. Who absorbs this first? First, it's absorbed by businesses. And these are also people that you should try to impact on because these are also American people whose interests you need to care about. and then businesses pass them on to consumers uh, through higher fees and weaker services that does not keep up with their need. So I don't think that this is necessarily a debate winning impact in and of itself. But I do think that this is an impact which you can prove to be quite relevant because AI is becoming more and more and more relevant, and the expectations of people are also rising. So it would be in the interests of people to be able to use the best possible AI available to be able to potentially do as much of their useless manual labor work or useless cognitive labor work as they could. I mean, at least that's the pro AI stance that you would need to have in this kind of debate where you're talking about, oh, more chips are good. So, yeah, the commonality between both of these impacts is basically that there is an additional risk that, and this is true for Gov also. On Gov, we are saying that the non-existence of the state is creating a risk. On OP, we are saying that the existence of the state and the tenuousness and the uncertainty around whether the state will give approval or not is going to create risk. And when we build risk first, in most finance and economics motions, we are able to first take risk, or we're able to take some kind of liability, some kind of problem that people have. And then we realize that whoever is facing this risk, whoever is bearing this risk, whoever is bearing a cost, they are inevitably going to pass it on to the consumers. And therefore, it would not be in the interest of consumers. And this, I would say, is how you should uh, analyze these types of motions. These are the questions that I've covered, are the questions that you should ask yourselves. And these are just example impacts, of course. I wouldn't claim that these are the strongest impacts. My purpose with these impacts was simply to be able to show you how we can utilize the spec that we have learned to be able to integrate it and build certain impacts that would be unpredictable for a spec illiterate team. Like for a team that is spec illiterate, they would probably not be able to see our impacts coming. This would be useful for us because lower predictability means like they've had less time and mental effort to be that they've spent to be able to respond to you. They're put on the spot to be able to first understand what you're saying, but then secondly respond to you. You should force them to work hard to understand what you're saying. I mean, you should try your best to be clear. But yeah, running unpredictable cases that exactly align with the exact specific niche burden of a complicated motion type is a good skill to have. And all the best for whenever you debate American industry and finance.